So I encourage people to not tune those people out. And we're kind of in a moment where if somebody doesn't agree with you, then you tune them out. And
Mm.
that tuning out for the past like 7 years or 5 years that we've been doing has actually left us ignorant. And I know it's hard for people because nobody wants to hear things that are offensive, right? Like nobody wants to negotiate their humanity. But again, know your history. Specifically, Black Americans have always been negotiating their humanity in this world, not just in the US, but global anti-Blackness is real. And I think
Yeah.
what's unfortunate is that there are a lot of groups, not only Black folks, but minority groups in this country too, who have kind of had like a renewed sense of identity post 2020, who forget that that has always been the exchange of oppression, right? Like
Uh-huh.
going back to your mom's point about like Bill Clinton, that's not a new phenomenon, right? Like the flawed candidate is not a new concept. And I think what I would encourage Gen Z to do is stop desiring perfection. We will not see it here. It's not going to happen.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Check-In Podcast. My name is Camryn Joi, and on this episode of the Check-In Podcast, well, actually, let me backtrack. First of all, if you're not new to this and you're true to this and you've been tuning in since 2020, I want to thank you. I want to commend you. I want to show my gratitude for your support. Now, if you are new to this, it's okay. The Check-In Podcast is a podcast for teens and young adults alike to check in with each other and have conversations about the everyday challenges, triumphs, and everything in between in our lives. It's a safe space for us, and that's why I started it. This season of the Check-In Podcast, however, we are narrowing down on a theme. And this theme this season is self-care. Now, we're not just talking about the self-indulgence aspects of self-care, like your skincare routine, your hair care routine, saying no to things and stuff like that. We're actually talking about the things that not only help us be better versions of ourselves for ourselves, but better versions of ourselves for our community. I always talk about what the 5 pillars of self-care are when I open up the episode, and I'll just repeat them again for you guys. But the 5 pillars of self-care are actually nutrition, exercise, meditation or spiritual practice, journaling, and community, which is what our episode is going to be about today. I invite you guys to tune into this episode and learn how to not just be a me, but be a we. On today's episode of the Check-In Podcast, I have my lovely guest, Dr. Nia Johnson. Dr. Nia Johnson, thank you so much for tuning into the Check-In Podcast.
Of course, I'm really excited to be here. This is going to be great. I've been looking forward to it all week.
Oh, yes, I love to hear that. So, for our listeners out there who do not know you, I have Dr. Nia Johnson on the podcast for a very specific reason. I feel like her areas of expertise lie in a lot of community care and community work. So, if you could just give us just a quick little rundown of who you are and what you do for the audience.
Sure. So I'm currently a visiting assistant professor of law and science and society at Duke University. I am getting ready to transition into a tenure track position as an assistant professor of law at Wake Forest University. So I'm a North Carolina girly now. A lot of the work that I do really encompasses health law, public health, race relations, and also politics. So I pretty much just try to break down, questions about public health infrastructure, what political forces build up public health infrastructure, and then also what political forces can tear down public health infrastructure. And some of that is examining the ways that race is used as a divisive tool.
Mhm.
Um, Also within the community, like I think as Black folks, we think we're excluded from that.
Right.
But then also how race can be used as a collaborative tool in my work.
I'm so glad that you talked about how politics can be used, like in the public sector and used in public health and in shaping public health, but also destroying public health, especially because, as you know, as everybody knows, we are transitioning in the midst of a transition of a new presidency and a second Trump presidency at that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people out there are feeling very frightened, very hopeless, and um, a lot of the structure of our nation's fabric is being destroyed day by day by day. So
Mhm.
to open up this conversation, I really want to know, what does self-care mean to you in a society that, currently and often feels indifferent to our well-being?
Yeah. It's so interesting that you frame this about being indifferent to our well-being, because I think we're in a moment where a lot of people are seeking to be callous themselves. We can even look at, like, for example, like the trad wife movement, right? And if you think about it, like the trad wife movement is actually a bit of an offshoot of the soft life movement as well, where
Yes.
you had a lot of women who are like, I'm sorry, like being a girl boss is exhausting. Black women are doing intense amounts of labor. We want to do less labor. Women are doing a lot of labor. Let's do less labor. Let's transition into the soft life. And then you get the rise of Nara Smith, who seems to be living the soft life, but really that's evolved into being a trad wife. And if you think about it, we've kind of seen this pivot from like self-care to really selfishness, right? So, part of the reason that, and I'm not here to like, disrupt anybody's personal goals. Like, I think
Hmm.
there are reasons to have like traditional gender models in your
Right.
home, and there are reasons that you may not want to. But if you think about it at its core, a lot of it is really revolving around being self-serving, right? Like,
Yep.
so in order for me to maybe not have to quote unquote work as hard, I've now pulled all of this work into the home, so that way my partner can buy me things, and so I don't have to go out and do this for myself, right? It's the Meg the Stallion. I'm in my bag, but I'm in his too. And
Yes.
so I say that to say, for me in this stage, as somebody who has watched a number of movements throughout my career, is that self-care for me is actually being in service to other people, and actually spending time investing in my community,
Mhm.
and investing in specifically my local community and my spiritual community, and finding ways to take, what I consider to be blessings in my own life and
Mhm.
give them back to other people.
Because you brought up like trad wife
Mhm.
and kind of just the self-indulgent, self-serving aspects of self-care taking root. Do you think that had any impact on the election in any type of way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. Like no question about it, of course.
Hmm.
And I think it was for a couple of reasons, right? So
Okay.
some of it is like, typical factors that impact elections, such as economic instability,
Hmm.
right? If a candidate promises he can bring down, for example, the price of groceries
Hmm.
or bring down the price of cars or homes or what have you, then yes, right? Like those are things that can galvanize people. And in a way that is self-serving, right?
Right.
You want your grocery prices to go down. Whereas, there are other candidates, especially during this election cycle, that ran on things that actually were a little bit more abstract and immediately affected somebody else. So,
Hmm.
so for example, like paid leave, if you're a parent, right? So if you yourself, or rather, let me say it this way: everybody is not a parent. Most people, though, do buy groceries, right? And so, in
Right.
order to care about some type of credit for you to stay at home, you have to care about somebody else. Let's say, you're somebody where you're like, oh, well, I already stay home, so I don't need this. Therefore, I don't need to vote for it, right? So, I think that's a huge part of it. But
Uh-huh.
I also think that, there has been also a major backlash that has kind of been cranking up for a while post Obama, really specifically in white communities, I think in
Yes.
male communities as well, saying that, well, this is a zero-sum game for equality, right? So they're saying that, oh, if we allow for this particular group of people to get ahead, or to have opportunities, then they are taking things from us. And
Hmm.
therefore, I need to act in my best interest. And then lastly, even if you think of like, what Donald Trump portrays to many men, especially in a time where I think there's a deficit in male role models, at the same time that there is a lot of online rhetoric about how men are dysfunctional, bothersome, don't contribute to society, negative, like, like when you have that being kind of things that we think are funny on social media, but have also been managed to be galvanized as political fodder.
Right.
Donald Trump gives power, right? Like he provides, a feeling of importance and something for men to look up to,
Hmm.
right? You can imagine in a time of economic instability, if you believe that quote unquote your birthright is being taken from you,
Hmm.
then you can look to somebody like Donald Trump and see the man you want to be, right? And in this country, this is a constant theme of like whenever we see, gains towards equality, that there's a question of whether this is a zero-sum game.
Right.
And so I think that that's something that specifically the Republican Party has always been able to use well
Mhm.
for political mobilization. And I think it's something that's actually very understudied,
Mhm.
not only by Democrats, but also by people who consider themselves to be like far left or like far progressive liberals.
Yeah.
They forget that that is one of the best tools they have. And so when you galvanize that type of selfishness and self-centeredness and you package it in something that's easy to understand,
Mhm.
then you end up with the election result that you get, which is
Yeah.
unfortunately true.
It is unfortunate, but you mentioned something about not having role models, male role models. And I think in general, I feel like a big portion, we can talk about all of the white people, white men, white women, even Latinos who voted for Trump, but we can't talk about this election without acknowledging kind of the role that our generation, well, my generation, Gen Z, and even millennials played in this election outcome, in terms of, you know, um, galvanizing people behind one specific,
Yeah,
topic and making that
yeah.
the end all be all. And it had me thinking about something that Kiki Palmer was recently on a podcast with Michelle Obama and
Mhm.
her brother Craig Robinson, and she was just talking about how, like, like when our generation faces like the first sign of trouble, it's we gotta go, we gotta split,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
oftentimes we don't know how to get through things.
Yeah.
We don't know how
Mhm.
to get through things. We don't know how to get to the other side and move
Mhm.
as a we.
Mhm.
And it had me thinking about this election a lot because I really feel like people were just so short-sighted. And I'm
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I want to know if there's any type of practice or work that you are doing within your community work that is kind of helping us learn how to be a we again and learn how to kind of get through things and not
Mhm.
be overwhelmed by things that are just it's just going to take some time to get through. You know what I mean? We're not going to get
Yeah.
it just means it's going to take some time.
Yeah. And let me actually take it back a little bit because,
Mhm.
I think there's a version of the work that I could do that could be considered a critique of conservatives, but honestly, that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm
Mhm.
really more so interested in critiques of liberal politics as well, because I think a lot of times liberal those who align themselves like on the left or on the far right, I'm sorry, left or far left, tend to believe that they kind of know everything and that they're not subject to these same types of means. And I think like what you said was so important that this election was watered down to one issue for many people. And
Mhm.
part of the issue is that I think we're in a moment where, since we flattened the plane of information, where anybody can go online and like learn new words or learn new topics, but not necessarily have the same amount of depth that's required to be a researcher or to be well versed in a topic. Everybody thinks that they get to decide the final say,
Yep.
what we should be doing and not doing. And, like something I've been saying quite a bit lately is like, many people just went out and learned the words imperialistic and decided, yeah, well, I just don't need the American experiment to work. And it's like, well, first of all, many of you are not trying to immigrate other places. Many times when Americans do immigrate places, they disrupt the economy, right? So, for example, I'm sure you probably have seen on TikTok when people go to Ghana and they tip their braiders $300. And then finally, like folks have had to say, like, please stop doing that. You're disrupting the braiding economy, right? Because of currency difference and some of these other things. You go to other countries. We've also seen, a couple years ago, there was a couple that went to Thailand and overstayed their visa. And we're surprised that they were incarcerated. And it's like, yeah, you have to respect the bounds of a visa. Like Americans, including Black Americans, because
Mhm.
that was a Black couple, have really struggled to be respectful of other places, which is the number one requirement of being an immigrant, right?
Yeah.
Like to name it something different, being an expat. And so we're not really
Community.
above this. Yeah, like we're not above this American exceptionalism. And
Hmm.
so to turn this election into like a one vein or one-sided issue, I think it was short-sighted. And that really ties into the point of like, how do you endure?
Hmm.
Part of endurance is actually engaging in strategy, right? Like I think we're in a moment where we were let's say 15 years ago, right at the start, a little under 15 years ago, the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. Part of the reason that movement started was because there was a critique of having like a single leader-led movement,
Yeah.
right? And so they wanted it to be a grassroots movement where everybody could be involved. But who could have seen that 15 years later, now everybody being involved actually muddles the voices? And I do believe that even the movements that we look up to are worthy of critique, just like people critique the civil rights movement. We can also critique Black Lives Matter. We could critique the modalities. And so what I do in my own work is that when, for example, when I teach, I try to encourage my students to be articulate about those conversations.
Hmm.
Like I don't let them gloss over it. I don't let them say that anything is perfect. I make them sit with the discomfort because I think that's a skill set that many Gen Z and Gen Alpha students do not have,
Yeah.
because we've been born into an era of hyper morality, right? Where like if it's not perfectly said, then it's not worth hearing.
Hmm.
And that ties into the other thing I try to do, which is I try to listen to the elders in my life, not because I necessarily agree with them, but because they have seen more than I have seen. And we've lost a lot of intergenerational conversations over, rhetoric, right? It's like,
Rhetoric,
you won't say it
social
right, Maya
media.
versus Nima. And it's
Uh-huh.
like, yeah, but y'all just got here.
Yeah.
Like Nima has lived, right? And so I'm trying to be somebody who is more thoughtful in that discourse and extending grace to the people who are older than me.
Hmm.
And then the one last thing I will say is actually identifying needs in your immediate community.
Yeah.
I grew up in a larger city. And this is my first time really living in a small town. And so one of the things I learned during my doctoral training was to read the local paper, right? Like the best way to understand politics in a particular state or area is to read the local paper. And so any city I go to, I try to like pick up a local paper and just kind of skim it to see like, what the
Mhm.
political temperature is in the area, what do people care about, like who's on the city council.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you actually notice that there are many ways to be involved and make a difference in one or two people's lives, 10 people's lives, 100 people's lives. And it's actually, I have found more impactful than just like resharing the same news stories on Instagram, right? Like that's not how you build a movement.
It
And so
is.
I've been trying to do that too.
There's so many things that you brought up that I wanna touch on. That
Mhm.
last piece that you said, I do really want to touch on it because I think because of the era of social media, oftentimes our community care is to the extent of using your voice.
Yeah. Amplify, amplify, amplify.
Amplify.
Hashtag amplify. Yeah.
But it's like you also have to show up. Like that's the part of community care that I think people
Mhm.
are not like the cost of community is inconvenience.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
people aren't looking to be inconvenienced in any type of way.
Hmm.
Not looking to this goes back to the moving as a we. They're not,
Yeah.
looking to hang with people during hard times. You got people talking about something. If my friend doesn't talk to me for 6 months, she's cut. And it's
Yeah.
like your friend is going through the divorce of her parents, and
Yeah.
she's being a therapist to both of her parents, and
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
and because she didn't text you back, your pride is in the way, and now you can't even say, "Hey, girl, like you didn't text me back. It's not like you. Just want to see if you're okay."
Yeah.
Stuff
Yeah.
like that. Like
Hmm.
it's something to like really really think about. I had an epiphany. I was watching this show called Snowfall.
Oh, I love Snowfall.
Snowfall's my favorite show
So
ever.
good.
I
Hmm.
love Snowfall. But I was watching Snowfall, and then in the middle of watching Snowfall, I also ended up watching this actual documentary about the crack cocaine epidemic. And I was looking at this stuff, and I was talking to my mom. I was like, "How did y'all vote for um not Joe Biden,
Uh,
golly, what's his name,
I
Bill
think
Clinton?"
it,
I'm like,
yeah.
I'll vote for Bill Clinton, and he's the whole reason why we have SWAT and why we have all of these like insane drug laws and this,
Mhm.
that, and the third. I'm like, what were y'all thinking? And then she had to explain to me. She was like, babe, I lived through the 90s. She was like, it was scary.
Yeah.
She was like, nobody had a handle on the community. Everybody was on this drug that was making them do crazy things. The
Mhm.
boys didn't have no fathers. The mothers were exchanging their babe. Like she was
Yeah.
we begged for help, and she was like, nobody could have known that it would have turned into that later on.
Yeah. And I'm sorry just to interrupt you, but like I think what a lot of times people don't realize, because the reality is that people don't read. Like they really don't try to know their history. And what people don't understand is that, first of all, government is inherently flawed.
Yeah.
Like, people out here like talking about, oh yeah, we're just going to go to Canada because they have universal health care. I'm like, they also have wait times into eternity. That's one of the biggest aspects of when you have universal coverage,
Yeah.
right? But people don't know that because people don't read. And I think so people think that all governments outside of the US are perfect. And it's like, no, no, no. Have you seen the secret of police in Latin America, amongst other places? Anywhere you go is flawed. But on top of that, it's very normal to not fully know the byproduct of a law or a policy when you vote for it. We're
Yeah.
even seeing that right now, right? Like, there were folks who thought, oh, I thought Donald Trump was going to bring down the cost of eggs and allow for me to get IVF. He actually is making my car more expensive, and I lost my job with the National Park Service, right? Like, this is a normal process of not fully knowing how laws are going to turn out. We live in an era where everything is a photo op. And I think a lot of times people like to critique politicians for that. They're like, oh, they're just here for a photo, right? Like that's always the joke we hear about politicians. But the reality is that we do this too. So like, I'll share something that I've never really like shared before. I don't know if we could call it an exclusive, but I'm not a marcher. I don't participate in marches, especially in this particular, not even in this particular moment, but I have felt this way for years. And part of the reason I do not is because I have spent a fair amount of time engaging in the previous movements of the past. And one of the main things that actually made those marches work is that people were willing to be battered to the ground. Like people don't realize that the civil rights movement worked because of television and that the country had to watch as a captive audience how people in the South were treating Black folks who were agitating for their freedom. And what I used to see is that from 2013 to now, people go to a march and then they go to brunch afterwards, or they
Yep.
hold up a sign and then they take a photo of it. They're marching, but they don't exactly know what they're marching for. They don't necessarily who they're talking to. They're not going to their state legislature and negotiating. There are many community organizers who do this, especially when they're reputable. But y'all are going for a photo op. And I was like, I don't think this is the best use of my time.
It's
And I also don't think it's the best use of a policy. And so I personally do not participate, which is hard to admit as a person who is, I apologize. I thought I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. It's hard for me to support those type of performative actions. And that was years ago. And so it's unfortunate because now we're like I said, like 12 years after this major movement, and people are realizing for the first time that either what they were doing or what the people around them were doing was inherently performative. And
mhm.
I'm like, yeah, babe, it has been. The moment that you started flicking it up to the gram, or not to the gram, but flicking it up to the gram, that yeah, you were at like, whatever protests, you kind of lost the value, and it's not hard to do.
Yeah. And even with that, like I'm I'm not anti-march because of that. I have gone to a few marches in the past. I'm more so anti-march now because I feel like, well, for one, I always I explain to people that like, like a lot of you all, especially with the election, a lot of you all are not willing to die over these issues. So you have to take action in another way. And me personally, I'm not willing to die about it.
Hmm.
At least not yet. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
I don't
Hmm.
feel like there. I don't even feel like we even got to get there yet. While we have all of these other tools that we are not that we haven't exhausted yet. But that's one of the reasons. The second reason is because I'm not willing to be like identified, like get up on police scanners and stuff like that. That's the whole reason. I love tattoos. I only have them in places where I can cover them.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to be identified. I don't want to be. It's not that I don't want people to understand where I stand and where
Hmm.
my integrity, my morals lie, but I can't do the work from a prison.
I
So
mean, and it's a really fraught time. Like, we've seen so much of this with, the ICE detainment of folks who are pro-Palestine, and how they've like shaped the law to say like, oh, they are inherently pro-Hamas, and so therefore they deserve to be detained or have their visas revoked. And that's what I mean when I talk about stakes, and even going back to dying. And this is why it's so important that we read and we really are like involved. Is that first of all, there were so many people that died for this work. I mean, Medgar Evers was shot in front of his wife and children. Like people have to sit with that. But then there were also, and this is the second point, there were so many ways to actually get involved that actually may align with your skill set a little bit better than simply organizing a march, that also have a more direct impact, right? Like when we think about what are we actually here to do? So again, first of all, some of this is like, just being involved like in your state legislature, like see the bills that are passing in your state. You will be surprised how many issues are very partisan at the federal level. When you get to the state and local level, it is not partisan because state senators and state representatives, they feel the impact of policies very quickly in the community. When
Yeah.
you see like, what is his name? Um, I mean, let's even take like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, or even AOC is a good example, Jasmine Crockett.
Mhm.
Like part of what they do is sound bites, right? Like their job to some extent is to get up front and be visually seen,
Yeah.
have snippy things to say. And that may not mean that they don't care about their constituents. I'm not prepared to make that statement. But when you talk to state legislators and such, they are on the ground, right? Like they know what it means when the kids can't read in their
Yes.
district. Right. And so y'all don't even try to go to those sessions, right? Like, that's what people need to be organizing. Yeah.
How do you like personally balance self-care with community care?
So my self-care looks like a couple of different things. And I'll go to the historical point and then I'll go to like some of the things I actively do right now.
Mhm.
So a big part of self-care for me is reflection. So I think whenever I feel ungrounded in this moment or fearful, I go back to my spiritual practice as a Christian and thinking about, what do I know about my own life and how God has shown up for me. But then what I also do is that I think about what the people before me went through, right? And that's why I always say it's so important to read and not just like read a post, like read something hard, like that you can touch. I think it's easy to forget that people lost their jobs during the civil rights movement, right? Like, this moment of unemployment while standing up for what is right is not new,
Right.
right? So I think about that. I think about, how Thurgood Marshall was, elected to the Supreme Court. And it still wasn't enough. Like there still was a movement that was required after him. So that helps me feel grounded because I think about, what other people have gone through. And
Mhm.
it helps me remember that I don't have to be afraid. And I think that's also something specific to me now living in the South.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the people who are the most afraid online are, what would be considered coastal elites, right? Like folks who have had the privilege of not having to organize for these things. And I would also say, and not really have to engage in collective action, right? Because if you live in a state that's homogeneous, you don't really have to fight for the same things, although this is their first time
Mhm.
feeling this uncertainty. And so I've really taken regionalism seriously. And so I reflect. On a more tangible level, girl, I do not watch the news. There is nothing that cable news needs to tell me. There isn't. It's the same thing every day. It's designed to be
Mhm.
incendiary. And it's funny, I was telling my students about like, how ads work on news websites, especially for cable news, and they did not know this. So I guess I feel like I need to say this out loud. So what people don't understand is that many cable news websites run off of ad dollars. And so we could conceptualize that back in the day with like a newspaper, right? Like you opened a new, well, maybe you didn't, but back in the day, you used to open a newspaper and maybe you would book out like like a full page ad or like a quarter ad and then you had an ad section, right? And so or if you read Vogue or a magazine, you had advertising in the pages of the magazine.
Right.
But now that's through clicks online. And so what happens is that every time you click on an article, then those little ads you may see from like Nike or from Saks or from Safeway or like a grocery store, Amazon, that is ad traffic. And so that means that they want you to click on these articles so that way advertisers can continue to pay their bills. And so they are going to give you the most outlandish headlines. They're going to give you the most fear-filled headlines because fear generates clicks. So yeah, so if we think back to like 2013 when Black Lives Matter started, we didn't even have quote unquote the algorithm the way we do today. A lot of times what you saw on social media was first of all determined by timing, right? So the most recent posts were placed first. That has changed drastically, not only on platforms like X, but also on TikTok and on Instagram. And so the way that we receive that content is very different. It means that we may not necessarily see things that are timely. The
Mhm.
other thing that has changed is that now, because content creation has budded really into a very viable career for many people,
Right.
people are invested in giving people the things that they want to see in a way that wasn't necessarily the case in 2013. And so to keep treating social media like it's the same, right? Like, oh, it was like the purest institution back then when we were, like trying to organize for Black Lives Matter or something like that. That is not the same right now, right? Like there are literally social justice influencers, people who are monetized to keep you abreast of social issues and also to skew your perspective on social issues as well. This is a fundamentally different beast. And so I think it's very okay nowadays to just be like, yeah, I'm not going to engage because again, the algorithm only gives you what you want it to give you. And so if you want to be in a constant state of anxiety, it will give that to you. But if you want to have peace of mind, it will give that to you too. And so for me, I just feel like I'm at a stage in my life where I don't have to give it all of my time, right? Like, remember,
Mhm.
you stopped, and this is like a controversial take, but like, you stopped talking to your uncle who couldn't use pronouns correctly. So that means you don't actually know what he's thinking. Maybe you do, but you don't know everything that resonates with him. And so you
Yeah.
can't really build an opposition if you don't know what both sides mean. And I think this would be something where a lot of people should take this time to listen and like regroup and think about what is the actual temperature of the country, not the temperature of the country that you want, right? Because I
Yeah.
want people to use pronouns correctly. I want
Mhm.
people to care about racial equity. I want people to consider gender equality.
Mhm.
However, we have now learned that most people don't really care about that. And a
Yeah.
lot of the performative actions that we've seen from many other people have gotten shaken out in the wash. So I think that we should just be mindful that this is designed to be incendiary. It's designed to not make you feel good. It's designed to make you feel hopeless. But in the same breath, it's telling us a lot about the country. And this is not the time to not tune into those deeper messages, right? Like as Maya Angelou says, if somebody shows you who they are, believe
Mhm.
them.
Yeah.
And I think for us, it's a question of not being avoidant to that reality and thinking about what is political organizing and collaboration, and also like oh man, of course I'm forgetting the word right now. Collaboration and also negotiation look like during these times, rather
Right.
than solely focusing on an all or nothing approach. Because
Mhm.
we did that, if we're being honest. Many people advocated for an all or nothing approach, and we actually just got nothing.
Yeah. I like that you said that because I think it goes into my next question. Because you said now is not the time to like tune out,
Mhm.
but Gen Z being the generation that's chronically online and
Yeah.
is chronically feeling overwhelmed by the state of the world, what is the advice that you could like give them for how to stay in it but not be consumed by it?
Yeah. So when I say like this is not the time to tune out, I don't necessarily mean like not tuning out the news. Because again, like cable news is designed for ratings,
Hmm.
right? It's not the Associated Press where they were just supposed to like tell you the bar for bar. Most
Yeah.
of the information I get is through specific news channels we have for my job.
Hmm.
And so I read those because I need to be abreast of like cases and like legislative changes and
Right.
bills and those type of things. What I'm talking about is thinking and reflecting on the state of the world and where we are, right? Like if you've seen a pivot to TradWives, you should be curious if you care about changing the world and creating a more equitable environment for women about why people desire to be TradWives,
Yeah.
not just brushing them off and saying, oh, you're just a servant to the patriarchy. Oh, you're
Hmm.
just down bad. No, no, no. Think about why somebody would want that. What do they gain from that? So I encourage people to not tune those people out. And we're kind of in a moment where if somebody doesn't agree with you, then you tune them out. And that tuning out for the past like 7 years or 5 years that we've been doing has actually left us ignorant. And I know it's hard for people because nobody wants to hear things that are offensive, right? Like nobody wants to negotiate their humanity. But again, know your history. Specifically, Black Americans have always been negotiating their humanity in this world, not just in
Hmm.
the US, but global anti-Blackness is real. And I think
Yeah.
what's unfortunate is that there are a lot of groups, not only Black folks, but minority groups in this country too, who have kind of had like a renewed sense of identity post 2020, who forget that that has always been the exchange of oppression, right? Like
Uh-huh.
going back to your mom's point about like Bill Clinton, that's not a new phenomenon, right? Like the flawed candidate is not a new concept. And I think what I would encourage Gen Z to do is stop desiring perfection. We will not see it here. It's not going to happen. And I don't say that like, it's coming from like a Christian persuasion, but like the
Mhm.
evidence has shown us, right? Like we're not going to get perfection. You're going to have to learn how to negotiate. You're going to have to learn how to listen to people who you don't agree with. You're going to have to learn how to talk to people who don't talk like you. Because I think what has happened is that people have been policed into behaving correctly. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that we're in a moment where like gentle parenting is going on, right? And people are like, oh, well, I just want my kids to get to be themselves because it's important that they get to be free. And it's interesting how we aren't affording that same freedom to adults. And so when you take that from people and you don't really give them the room to like quote unquote be themselves, as messy and flawed as they are, they will rebel. And
Mhm.
I think people forget that, the cost of having a secret ballot where you don't have to tell people what you voted for is that they can show one part of themselves to you to your face and then
Yeah.
go in the ballot box and do something very different. And so it's time that we tapped in, and not in a way that says like, oh, I just don't talk to them anymore,
Hmm.
but in a way that is critical and thoughtful about how we missed it,
Hmm.
and also what can we learn from it.
Hmm. I want to share with the audience this reading that I read.
Mhm.
What's it called? So the article is on analysis and it's by Daniel Hunter and it's called 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded
Mm,
now that Trump has won. And it came out literally November 4th. I think some of the
mm,
things that you were talking about, really are going to resonate with the audience. And so I'm just going to go through the 10 points. And it's not a lot, but the first one is to trust yourself. Um, I that being the first one makes me hesitate just a little bit, just because everybody does not start on the same level of knowledge,
Everybody's not trustworthy, but go ahead.
you know?
Go ahead,
But
Dr. Hunter. I've not met him personally, so I don't know
Mhm.
what his state of the world is. But yes.
Exactly. But he says that distrust fuels the flame of autocracy because it makes it much easier to divide. So we can
Mhm.
see that in the casual nature of Trump's rhetoric, telling people to distrust immigrants, Democrats,
Yeah.
socialists, people from Chicago, women marchers, Mexicans,
Yeah.
the press, and so on. So he said this is a social disease. You know who to trust by who they tell you to distrust.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a good
That's true.
one.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's the word. Mm-hmm.
Number two is find others who you trust.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I promise I'll head towards practical resistance strategies, but the emotional landscape matters a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism explored how destructive ideologies like fascism and autocracy grow. She used the word, I don't know how to say this, Verlesenheit, Verl, often translated as loneliness. Okay, as a
Mm-hmm.
central ingredient. As she
Yeah.
put it, loneliness isn't a feeling, but a kind of social isolation of the mind. Your
Mm-hmm.
thinking becomes closed off to the world and a sense of being abandoned to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Period.
Uh-huh. The third one is grieve. No matter
Mm-hmm.
what we try to do, there's going to be a lot of loss. The human thing to
Yes.
do is to grieve.
Yes.
If you aren't a feelings person, let me say it this way. The inability to grieve is a strategic error. So,
Yeah. And can I just like pause right there?
uh-huh.
'Cause I think that's a really, really, really critical point. I think a lot of people, going back to like this constant news consumption, I think a lot of times people turn to the news because they expect to see good news there one day. And I need people to like hear me today. If you care about marginalized groups, care about equity, didn't vote for Donald Trump, even if you voted for Donald Trump at this point, the news
Mhm.
has nothing good to give you. It's going to be bad and it's going to be hard. Like we are heading into a recession, in ways that this country probably hasn't seen for a very long time,
Yeah.
and you're going to reap those consequences. And
Mhm.
I think it's important that people make peace with that, and part of making peace with that is grieving. And once you have grieved it, then you can decide how are you going to literally help people.
He says, release that which you cannot change. So we all know the serenity prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Notably, that prayer comes from the theologian, I don't know if I'm saying
Theologian.
theologian, Reynold Niebuhr, as he was watching the rise of Nazis in Germany.
Mm,
Under
mm.
a Trump presidency, there are going to be so many issues that it'll be hard to accept that we cannot do it all. There's always something bad happening every day. If we had to react to every bad thing, we'd never have time to eat.
Yeah.
And then it says, chaos is a friend of the autocrat. One way we can unwittingly assist is by joining in the story that we have to do it all. Yeah. That includes public angsting and symbolic actions. Um, so posting outrage on social media, sharing awful news with each other, organizing marches and public statements is not going to really do it for you this time.
No.
Yeah. The fifth one says find your path.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he says, I've been writing scenarios of how a Trump presidency might play out. The initial weeks look chaotic no matter what. Okay, predicted it. But over time, some differentiated resistance pathways begin to emerge. One pathway is called protecting people. These are folks surviving and protecting our own, especially those of us directly targeted, such as trans people, folks choosing abortions, and immigrants. This might mean organizing outside current systems for healthcare and mutual aid, or moving resources to communities that are getting targeted. Further examples include starting immigrant welcoming committees, abortion support funds, or training volunteers on safety skills to respond to white nationalist violence.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big one, especially, with our generation, being overwhelmed, trying to figure out how to become a we.
Yeah.
Becoming a we doesn't mean tackling every issue at once and deciding,
Yeah. And you
that.
know what? And I think part of this is like we forget that there is an influx of information that we are exposed to that really is not normal.
Mhm.
Like, think of like how humans have consumed information over time. There was nothing like the internet to really shovel that into people's bodies as
Mhm.
quickly as it does right now. And because we've lived with it for the better part of 30 years, I think we forget that this is abnormal, right? Like, this is not how our bodies were designed. And it's okay to release some of that power and just like care about what you can care about. Like, this is something I have to, give my partner credit because he's the one who says this, to be a person who can see and do,
Mhm.
right? And I think there's something very specific about the internet that has shown us so much that we can't do anything about. Like, all due respect, you cannot go to the continent of Africa and negotiate a peace treaty in Sudan. The reality is that the average person does not have the range. You do
Mhm.
not have the social adeptness. Many of you are American exceptionalists. Yes, that's you too, Black people. You're not trained in international relations. You cannot do that. What you can do, though, is feed people, right? You can organize a job fair for federal workers, right? Like, that's a lot of what I'm doing right now, like resume matching for federal workers who have lost their jobs in my immediate community. You can volunteer somewhere, right? Like, there are actual things that you can do, but that requires true connection with
Right.
people. And I have just found, especially as somebody who lives in the South, and I was talking to my friend about this recently, that the longer I live here, the more I realize that, like, the quote unquote MAGA enemy is also not a monolith. And you actually can have real conversations and learn a lot about people's priorities if you just spend time with them and talk with them.
Yeah.
But that also requires serving people and
Yep.
being there for people in real physical ways. Like, we have to be in pursuit of humanity. And that's like, towards ourselves, like remembering that we're not supposed to be fire hosing information. Our
Mhm.
bodies are not built for that. Our nervous systems are not built for that. And we have evidence that that is the case. But then that
Right.
also means extending grace to other people and help and like giving validity, even though I do not agree.
Mhm.
Like, I don't agree with the girl who thought that she was only going to get IVF out of Donald Trump. I don't agree with her because I feel like, well, the evidence was clear that that wasn't going to be the only thing that you got. I may
Yeah.
also feel like you threw me under the bus in your pursuit of selfishness of in your
Mhm.
family and your idea of womanhood that I also fundamentally don't agree with. But she's a person and
Yeah.
she's a part of the electorate. And so
Yeah.
every minute that I, spend acting like she's dumb and she doesn't matter is a minute that I'm losing an opportunity to win a vote, right? And
Mhm.
we need political action because we are in a political crisis.
Yeah. Yes, we are in a political crisis, and that moves me to number 6, where he says, "Do not obey in advance and do not self-censor."
Mm,
Um, I
mhm.
see a lot of people obeying in advance, and it's understood. Like,
Yeah,
we're seeing that people get snatched up,
yeah, yeah.
but it's still not the majority of us,
Hmm.
And I think people, um, when you talk to people, you realize that you are actually a part of a majority. When you have real conversations with
Yeah,
people, like
agreed.
you realize, like, oh, like they've just been telling us that I'm a part of a minority.
Hmm.
But so many of us have overlapping interest,
Exactly.
um, and we don't even know it. We
No,
don't even know it.
because we don't really talk to people. And
Hmm.
I really do think, and it's funny because I haven't really thought about it until we were talking now, but like that's honestly, like I've always lived in big cities, actually. I'll just preface it by saying that. Like
Okay.
I lived in Boston, I lived in Philly, I lived in the DMV. Like I always lived in big places in the Northeast. And this is my first time like really living in smaller towns.
Hmm.
And that probably was the most transformative thing that you could build actual relationships with people. And
Hmm.
I've had to have like a variety of conversations with people, even with people where I'm on the same side of the aisle as them, but I don't agree. And I've
Right.
become more adept at holding space for all sorts of people. And I think that that's something that has just been lost. And I understand, like sometimes I see people post things where they say like these are political issues, like I don't know, like they'll make like voting locations, libraries, whatever, and then they say these are not, and it'll be some kind of umbrella statement of like my humanity, and it's like yes, that's how I feel. But also, when you really unpack with people like what their animosity is for different groups of people, it says a lot about their own humanity as well. And I
Hmm.
wonder if, and this is a critique I give to Christian people specifically all the time, where I'm like, okay, you were right, but now what? You're right, but nobody wants to talk to you, right? Like you're right, but nobody wants to, the church context, like people don't want to enter your building. And I
Yeah.
think there are many people who have become so obsessed with being on the right side of history that they didn't think about the now what, which is that, yeah, but this is a majority democracy. Right?
Hmm.
Like y'all didn't sign up for autocracy either, clearly.
Yeah.
But in signing up for democracy, that inherently requires compromise. Because people forget that there are liberal autocracies, right? We can think of a place like Singapore, where they have
Hmm.
healthcare, it's extremely clean. There's a lot of wealth. You can't protest in Singapore though.
Right.
Right. And so it goes both ways. And so if you're committed to democracy, then you need to also be committed to the friction of disagreement. And part of that means believing that even the people you disagree with on a deep and personal level are
Hmm.
also still people and are not necessarily unreasonable. Are there unreasonable pockets? Yes. And I have seen them and I know them well. But there are many other people who don't necessarily fall in that space. And if you
Right.
demonizing them, we're never going to see a one election, and that actually matters. And I hope people
Yeah.
that.
That and you just completely summed up his seventh point, which was reorient your political map. And he
Mm,
was basically talking about this stuff, like, like get out of your bubble. Obviously, that didn't work. You
mm-hmm.
got to talk to people, and you got to, through conversation, you have to get to the root cause. And it
Yeah.
reminded me of a video I saw the other day where it was like the cost of intimacy is friction. Like
Yeah.
when you get that close to somebody, you're bound to. But how do you, again, back to Kiki Palmer's statement, like how do we move as a we and get through these things in history and in time versus like moving as a me? Because the me,
Yeah.
you're not going to go far.
We have to listen, like really, no, like really and truly listen and listen to like real policy issues, real things that people need, real modes of legal change. One
Hmm.
thing that I love about being a lawyer in this moment by training is that those are the people right now who are doing what they know to do. Like the
Hmm.
litigators, they know how to litigate. They know what causes of actions to bring. Like I spoke to immigration lawyers, who were like, "Oh no, we've had these complaints in the chamber," right?
Right.
Like, and part of that is through listening and knowing both sides and knowing the substance. And I
Hmm.
think before anybody can organize anything, you got to know the substance of what people want.
And speaking of organizing everything, his eighth point is to get real about power. Um, Trump has been very clear about using his political power to its fullest, stretching and breaking the norms and laws that get in his way. The movement will constantly be asking itself, are you able to stop this new bad thing?
Yeah.
We're not going to convince him not to do these things. No pressure on Republicans will result in more than the tiniest of crumbs, at least initially. We're not going to stop him from doing these things just by persuasive tactics or showing that there are a lot of us who oppose them.
Yeah.
It will be helpful to have a power analysis in our minds, specifically that's known as the upside down triangle. This tool is built
Hmm.
to explain how power moves even under dictatorships. And I will plug it into this video here.
Yeah.
And the central tenet is that, like an upside down triangle, power can be unstable and naturally topples over without anything supporting it. And then Gene Sharp says, by themselves, rulers cannot collect taxes, enforce repressive laws and regulations, keep trains running on time, prepare national budgets, direct traffic, manage ports, print money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People provide these services to the ruler through a variety of organizations and institutions. If people would stop providing these skills, the ruler could not rule.
Yeah, period. I mean, and no, because there's something I want to say, but I'm gonna hold the line on that because that's my own little personal secret.
Okay.
But yeah, exactly. Like I think it's important that we remember that there's so much holding this infrastructure. And I think, and I wrestle with this because I talk with my students about this a lot, where I think so much discourse on power has centered on the oppressed, and rightfully so, right? Because the oppressed are the ones who need power, right? Like,
Mhm.
if you like, I think a lot of Black researchers like myself feel this way. We're constantly trying to prove a fact about oppression because we
Mhm.
have to, right? And it can feel exhausting. But I think we also forget the other side of power is that it's a push-pull. And so power never cedes quietly. And
Mhm.
sometimes, like, even when I talk to like my brightest students and my smartest students, I ask them, I'm like, did you really think the patriarchy was going to cede because you just told them to? Like, you're not offering them any incentives, right? Like, you're not offering them sex. You're not offering them a power that was commemorable to what they had before. You're not
Uh-huh.
offering them kind words. You're not smoothing them into it. You thought that they were just going to take this laying down? No, right?
Mhm.
Like, you thought that you were going to ask people to hand over, their birthright of supremacy.
Mhm.
You thought that that's how that was going to go. And people are like, well, yeah, but it was the right thing to do. And it's like, people don't care about the right thing,
Yeah.
care about what they can get, right? Like there are going to be people who get rich off of this presidency. Now, when those people stop getting rich is when probably aspects of the presidency are going to have conflict. But
Yeah.
no, this is not the right thing. Don't matter if no one cares about the right thing. You
Right.
have to learn how to incentivize people. And
Mhm.
that requires a deep analysis of some of the things that you don't like,
Yeah.
being willing to critique those things. But yeah, I think we've kind of like taken like the moral arc of justice a little too seriously.
Mhm.
And forget that, people are carnal in many different ways. And you have to be able to speak to that carnal nature to get some of the things you want. Because I mean, that's what Donald Trump does really well. Like he
He
knows
does.
how to seek what people desire in entertainment and the carnal nature of humanity.
And say it
Wow.
succinctly.
I'm sorry.
And say it succinctly, like I
Yes,
think.
he can tap into the deepest part of who you are in the simplest way.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest things that again, like far left liberals, like progressive liberals have done is that they've taken academic concepts and instead of teaching them, they've just said, oh, you're dumb if you don't know them. And as an educator, I take that very seriously. Like when I teach my classes, I really believe in the power of educating people and taking the time to walk them through understanding complex topics like race or like public health or epidemiology, political movements. And
Yes.
it's important that we actually teach. But I think a lot of folks don't want to teach no more.
Mhm.
They just want people to get it. And I get that because when you've lived under oppression, you understand your oppression quite adeptly, right? Because you have to navigate not being in that space. But I
Mhm.
think for a lot of people, they forget that that is something worthy of being taught. And if you're unwilling to teach people, if you keep calling people dumb, they're just going to get angry at you, whether you're
Yeah.
right or wrong.
That's so true. And to the point about Donald Trump, so we often make fun of how like illiterate he is and stuff like that. But the problem that people who I want to say consume him critically and who are educated is that he actually represents the majority of Americans.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so that's why he appeals so much because the majority of Americans do read at a fourth grade reading level.
yeah,
And I
exactly.
learned that when I was a communications fellow for National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration.
Yeah,
And one of the first things that they would tell us is that, when you are communicating, like we are the ones like who handle service. I mean, not weather, sorry, not service, weather service,
mhm,
natural disasters, stuff like that. And the first thing they told us is like, when you're communicating these natural disasters and information that the public needs, you can't use these big lofty words. I understand
yeah,
we all here, we all got our degree and stuff like that, but you have to bring it down because
yeah.
majority of the people, that's what they understand, that's how they read, and you know, that's what they do.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
to understand oppression is complex too. It's
Mhm.
irrational and complex. And I think sometimes like, like I think of like Black folks specifically, we undersell how much we understand about oppression, right?
Undersell or oversell?
Understand oppression,
Oh, uh-huh.
right? And how hard it is to just like transfer that knowledge to somebody else. Like I've had like conversations with people who also study politics, and I'll tell them like, the complexities, even of something as simple as like code switching and
Hmm.
how that's passed down through the generations, right? Like your parents explaining to you and your parents' parents explaining to you that you need to code switch and it's life or death, and the
Yes.
practice of doing it, that is a very complex action. And you can't just teach that to somebody randomly, right? Like otherwise it's stilted, right? Like the ability to talk or like, to talk like a group that you're not a part of, but make it feel natural. Like that takes a lot of work. And so, and it is inherently complex. Most people are living a much more simple existence. And
Hmm.
that's not something to be ashamed of.
Right.
Somebody whose work I've been highlighting a lot, especially when I've given talks, is Ali Lockman, who is a professor at Texas A&M University. And Ali, she's a colleague of mine, and she spent a lot of time studying like rural ideology around health. And I think anybody who's trying to prepare for like the next 4 years needs to read that work. And she talks about the positives and the negatives of rural ideology. And actually, when you read a lot of those positives, they resonate with what a lot of people, especially minorities, care about.
Yeah.
It's just the lens and the way that it's galvanized that creates all sorts of friction. And that's on our politicians, right? Like we forget that politicians are here to divide us. And we can actually decide we're not going to be divided.
Mhm.
Because the reality is that democracy is a group project, whether you like it or not. And it's a randomly assigned group project, right? Like it's not the group project where you get to pick your friends, all the girls who gonna get good grades. Like it's not that. It is the randomly assigned group project. And if you don't make it happen, it will not happen. And we
Mm.
have to be committed to that goal, even if it's not with people we agree with.
I like what you said towards the end about politicians supposed to be divide us because his ninth point is that handle fear, make violence rebound.
Mm,
Um, and this is basically like he's talking about just changing your attitude that around the things that are supposed to scare you. And
mm,
if you just treat like Teflon, make it bounce off you,
yeah.
then the opposition is going to have to redirect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so his conclusion wasn't that political violence isn't going to grow, but he noted that a key component of political violence is to intimidate and tell a story that they are the true victims.
Yeah.
Making political violence rebound requires refusing to be intimidated and resisting those threats so they can backfire.
Yeah.
I think
Mm,
a good one is that that thing that came out about those people in Ohio or it was Kentucky, one of the two,
mm,
and those white supremacists called themselves rolling up to the hood with their
mm,
guns and stuff like that. And all the black people that have their,
mm,
conceal and carry and all their firearms were standing out there. And then they started backtracking. And I was like, exactly. Because like, not to say, fight fire with fire or fight violence with violence, but nobody was in their house hiding because that was the expected approach, right?
mm, mhm.
They said, you have guns and we have guns. Don't want to take it there, but if it has to go there, just know we have no problem with it going there. And
And
I think like,
I'm in a space right now where like I'm trying to like, diffuse violence as much as possible because I think
yes,
people casual I think even now like when we see like increases in gun well not increases in gun ownership, but even like, ideas around gun ownership, I think people underestimate what it means to take a life and engage in violence and how that fundamentally changes you. Which is something that again, even if we think about rural culture around guns, which like I said, my colleague has talked about, it's something that is actually like and underpinned with a lot of ideas of safety. But what I
mhm,
will say is like, I'll give you another example. I was reading, I read a little bit of the New York Times, just kind of like overviews in the morning for work stuff. And they were talking about some of the executive orders that Donald Trump put out. And one of the things that they said as a critique to the Democrats is that, they seem to be disengaging from media. And it's interesting that the New York Times would say that because people have been critiquing the New York Times for the past year or so and the Washington Post for not reporting the information that people need to know. And so the
and
fact that
hiding it behind
and
paywalls.
hiding it behind paywalls, even though, like people don't buy newspapers anymore. So it's assuming the money comes from even putting aside the cost of a newspaper. Like let's just assume the
Mhm,
paywalls are gone. But, we think about all of this information they're posting now about Project 2025, what Donald Trump was willing to do, all of these opinion pieces. Like, that could have came out in the summer, right? We are now seeing it after the election, right? Because this is a cycle, right? When people are afraid, they want to know what's going on, especially their type of base. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting, like, oh, Democrat or liberal voters are just like dissociating from the news. And it's like, no, we're just dissociating from your news, right? Like, but again, like that's a disruption of their chain,
Mhm.
right? Like it's a disruption of how they do business, where it's like if we make it incendiary, if we make it fearful, if we make it hot, we will keep people buying the Washington Post. We'll keep people buying the New York Times. And what they're finding is that people are not responding to really what are quite violent headlines.
Yeah.
So now I give it, some time, they may have to start changing their strategy. And so, yes, like there's something we said about demonstrating that you are not afraid. But I also think, thinking towards like what you respond to is also really critical right now too. Because even if, for example, this particular essentially white supremacist group, even if they rode through Ohio or rode through Kentucky trying to make a statement about, what they look like, right? And the power that they're trying to reclaim,
Mhm.
you know, even if the Black folks did stay inside and just didn't give it any attention,
Mhm.
right? Like that loses its power too, right? Like there's power on both sides. It's power in being willing to fight, but there's also
Mhm.
power in ignoring it. And, I even think like back in the day, like, like people would say, like, if a guy is bothering you or whatever, or you want this guy to leave you alone, or you want to figure out if he really likes you or whatever, you just ignore him
Mhm.
because ignoring that person takes away their power, right? And so being thoughtful about what we choose to respond to is a huge part of this as well. So
Mhm.
I think there's power in resistance, but there's also power in not responding.
That's true. That's true. I want to close with his last point because I think it's something that's just so necessary right now. Um, and his last point is to envision a positive future. And it brings me to also, I seen an NPR interview with John Green earlier this week,
Love
and
him.
he said that hope, what he's realizing, every time he does the work, his work that he's required to do in his life, he says that he is constantly reminded that hope is necessary for the human condition. And
Yeah.
I think people don't realize that or don't remember that just because despair is kind of like what's on display right now.
Hmm.
But for those really looking for something like the hope is necessary to the human condition, and it's not something that you're necessarily going to find outside. You
Yeah.
have to be the change you want to see. I know everybody is sick of hearing that, but it's like you do rub off on other people. Other people rub off on you. Like it's
Yeah.
it's just something that you have to be consistent with
Yeah.
and like put real action behind those words because
Ooh, yeah.
because people think like, oh, well, girl, I could never stop shopping at Amazon. I could never stop shopping at Target. And it's like, and then I'd be like, oh, I haven't shopped at Amazon forever. What do you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah.
Oh, I plan stuff ahead of time. I also just don't consume as much anymore. Like, think about
Yeah.
what you actually need from Amazon. Like,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, and
Yeah.
then I feel like, I may not convince them overnight, but at least I'm a person that they can look to as an example. Like, oh, like this might actually be kind of possible, you know?
Yeah. And I wish you started out with that because I have a very long-winded academic response to this, like, eschewing of hope. I will
Uh,
distill it very quickly. I think that when people, got to a place where they were comfortable critiquing Barack Obama, they started critiquing these ideas of hope. And at the same time, there was also, an influx of, folks on social media being exposed to a lot of Black radical thought and Black critiques.
mhm.
And I think people, well, not I think, I know that folks on Twitter don't understand that critique is not the only way to engage with race relations. Like sometimes those are the people who like, have written a really fabulous book at the moment, right? Like those are the people who may be inserted in the conversation, but those aren't the only voices that are there. And so I think that convergence, right? Like I said, like people learn the word imperialistic and suddenly like, this government is not worth fighting for, right? Like,
Right.
that's kind of where people have ended up. And I think people think, I say that to say, that it is sophisticated to never be in a place of hope. It is sophisticated to always have a critique. It is sophisticated to always say that something is wrong. And people forget that, there are plenty of Black radical thinkers. Like we can even think of somebody like Bell Hooks, who always
Mhm.
positioned herself in a position of hope and
Yes.
towards who we could be. And I
Hmm.
think you have to give people something to hold on to. Like no one can live on a diet of kale, right? Like, yes, is kale good for you? Yes, is roughage good for you? Absolutely. But you can't live on that. And I
Hmm.
encourage people to, find something substantial to look for and to live with. Let that go. The people who have written the books on critique of like, certain institutions and what have you, they have the stomach for that. But
Yeah.
I know y'all personally, y'all don't have the stomach to live that way. And most humans don't.
Uh-huh.
Even I don't even gear my work in that capacity.
Yeah.
And, even the books that y'all read are also like a part of a machine, right? Like we could have a whole different conversation about like, what books are desired, right? Like who gets published, like what's a sexy story? It's usually one of oppression, right? Like I think it was that movie, American Fiction. And that won a couple
Yes.
of Oscars, like, like that, but that's the point, right? Like if you weren't telling a story
Movie.
about somebody coming up from the hood, it's not worth reading. And
Uh-huh.
I think people have to remember that you manufacture your own hope,
Uh-huh.
and you have to be committed to hope because it's needed for the human condition. Before we are people who just absorb information about the world, we are humans first.
Hmm.
We have to tap into our humanity, and that's really what's going to be what sustains us during this time.
Wow, well said. Thank you so much, Nia, for being on this episode of the Check-In Podcast. I've
Of
really,
course.
really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I know the younger generation can definitely like glean from some of the gems that you dropped for sure.
Oh, you're so kind. I, I want people to live through this moment.
Wow. You heard it here first, folks. You heard it here first. This episode has been just about how we can transition from a state of me to a state of we, and how important community care is in our self care practice. I want to remind everybody out there that if you have liked this episode, please do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. You can find the Check In Podcast on Instagram at the Check In Podcast One. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. I want to remind you guys, like I do every episode, to lead with light and to lead with love. And especially in this day and age, please, please, please have grace for yourself and grace for others. With that being said, I want to thank Nia Johnson, Dr. Nia Johnson, for coming on to this episode of the podcast. And I will see y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.